Europe once believed the conflict would end in days. Instead, it spiraled into a generation of fire, famine, and shattered kingdoms. This is the story of a war that nearly ended Europe itself. In the early 17th century, Europe stood on the edge of an abyss, unaware that a single spark would soon plunge it into 3 decades of unimaginable destruction. It began with a dispute so small it seemed destined to fade into history. Yet beneath its surface lay tensions that had been building for a century. Rival faiths, fractured alliances, and kings whose ambitions outweighed peace. When the spark finally ignited, it did not start a war. It unleashed a catastrophe. The first shots were fired not for land or gold, but for belief. A struggle of faiths transformed kingdoms into battlegrounds, neighbors into enemies, and churches into symbols of power. What began as a fight for religious freedom rapidly evolved into a brutal contest of supremacy. Empires saw opportunity in chaos. Armies marched not to defend ideals, but to expand influence, to claim crowns, to tip the balance of Europe in their favor. The continent became a chessboard, and its people, the pieces. For decades, Europe had simmered with quiet resentment. Kings insisted their doctrines were absolute truths. Princes swore their lands would follow the creed they proclaimed. Popes, electors, and preachers all declared themselves guardians of righteousness. Yet beneath this armor of certainty lay a truth no ruler dared to admit. Europe was cracking. The old unity of Christendom had shattered, and what remained was a mosaic of fear and rivalry, waiting for the smallest force to break apart. That force came not from a battlefield, but from a room high in a castle tower. A confrontation, a refusal, a moment of defiance, and then a sudden, shocking act that echoed across the continent. What should have been an isolated incident became the spark that lit a Europe already drenched in tension. The news traveled like fire across dry fields. Printers rushed to published accounts, pamphleteers spread outrage, and preachers fueled the flames from every pulpit. But the true danger was not the act itself. It was the memory it awakened, the fear that rival confessions, once again, sought dominance. In cities divided by altars, neighbors began to look at one another, not with familiarity, but suspicion. Markets fell silent. Streets emptied at dusk, and the air grew heavy with rumor. People whispered of imminent invasions and secret alliances. Every church bell seemed to ring an alarm. Europe had become a tinderbox. 3 generations had grown up after the Reformation, but the scars of religious wars still ran deep. Families remembered burned homes and lost fathers. The peace that existed was not harmony. It was exhaustion, and exhaustion, as Europe soon learned, is not protection against catastrophe. As the spark spread, rulers rushed to stake their claims. Some proclaimed they acted in defense of the true faith. Others insisted they were restoring order. Many simply saw opportunity in the chaos. Conflicted loyalties merged into a web so tangled that even diplomats struggled to understand who stood with whom. Alliances seemed to shift with every sunrise. Princes pledging loyalty to enemies of their own religion. Soldiers marching under banners they barely recognized. In the center of this storm were the ordinary people, the farmers, craftsmen, and families who had no control over the fate unfolding around them. For them, the first signs of war came not from battlefield trumpets, but from the sudden silence of trade routes, the arrival of soldiers demanding quarter, and the hurried flight of refugees carrying whatever they could salvage. The fields that once promised harvest became the first battlegrounds. The granaries meant to feed communities were emptied by passing armies, and the roads once traveled by merchants became rivers of displaced families, wandering with no destination, seeking safety in a world where no corner seemed untouched. The continent's rulers believed the conflict would be short. They assumed a swift victory would restore balance and silence dissent, but they were blind to the depth of resentment and ambition that had been building for decades. Every faction believed itself righteous. every leader imagined. Victory assured, every soldier believed God stood on his side, and so the war that was expected to last months stretched into years, then decades. This was not a war of soldiers alone. It was a war that consumed civilians with equal brutality. Villages burned. Harvests rotted in the fields. Famine, plague, and merciless armies swept across the land, leaving devastation that would scar Europe for generations. Entire regions lost half their population. Cities once thriving with culture were reduced to ashes. The war did not move like a single storm, it moved like a season, returning year after year, darker each time. Religious fervor, once a unifying force, became a weapon wielded by countless hands. Armies marched to hymns, burned villages in the name of purity, and slaughtered those who prayed differently. Priests blessed weapons before battles. Faith, instead of healing wounds, became the blade that cut Europe apart. Cities that had stood for centuries were swallowed by flames. Land that once fed nations turned barren under the boots of mercenaries. The war did not move in a single direction. It swarmed. One year brought famine, the next pestilence, the next invasion. Winter became a season feared more than battle. The early days of the conflict revealed something terrifying: how fragile civilization truly was. It took only a spark to unravel the fabric that held nations together. A single act of outrage had become a chain of devastation, a storm gathering strength until it was unstoppable. Yet even as the continent darkened, a strange resilience rose among its people. They rebuilt homes only to lose them again. They tilled fields, even as armies marched toward them. They hid their children, prayed in secret, and clung to fragments of hope, even as the world around them crumbled. For amid the chaos, the human spirit refused to be extinguished. And as the continent drifted deeper into uncertainty, the conflict transformed. What began with cries for religious protection soon twisted into a ruthless contest of empires, where kings measured their ambitions not in prayers, but in armies. Not in principles, but in territory. Europe had waded into a storm it could no longer control. But amid the destruction, something irreversible began to take shape. The old order built on divine right, imperial dominance, and religious uniformity began to crack under the weight of its own contradictions. As alliances shifted, and empires struggled to maintain control, a new understanding of power emerged. States would no longer be bound together by faith alone, but by sovereignty, diplomacy, and reason. The Peace of Westphalia would become more than a treaty, it would become the blueprint of modern Europe. The 30 Years' War was not simply a conflict. It was a transformation, a crucible that destroyed kingdoms, yet forged a new political world. A tragedy that revealed the cost of fanaticism, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the profound resilience of human society. This is the story of a continent reborn through ruin. This is Europe's Cataclysm, the 30 Years' War. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, please consider subscribing for more journeys into the most critical moments in history. We'll see you in the next one. The first armies to march believed they fought for righteousness, but righteousness faded quickly beneath the hunger of conquest. Soon, the banners carried into battle no longer represented faith alone. They carried the weight of royal dreams, imperial calculations, and survival born from desperation. The war consumed every kingdom that touched it. Those who tried to avoid it found themselves dragged in by alliances centuries old, treaties long forgotten, and neighbors who feared being left behind. Neutrality became a myth, and safety an illusion. Battles grew larger, bloodier, more desperate. Soldiers from distant corners of the continent clashed in lands they had never seen before, under leaders whose names they could barely pronounce. What mattered was not who they fought for, but who paid them. Mercenary armies, ruthless, unpredictable, and driven by Prophet Rohe, freely leaving devastation wherever their boots fell. They fought for gold, not flags. Towns that surrendered were looted. Towns that resisted were erased. Fortresses that had stood unchallenged for centuries fell in days. Villages disappeared in the smoke of burning thatch. Great cities, once symbols of culture and power, found themselves besieged, starved, and mutilated. The war did not merely strike the powerful. It devoured the powerless. Roads, once filled with merchants, now crawled with the homeless, the starving, the abandoned. Children wandered in groups, unnamed and unclaimed. Mothers searched for food in fields, stripped bare by marching armies. Graves filled faster than they could be dug. The chaos did something far more sinister than destroy it. Blurred every line that once defined Europe. Catholics fought beside Protestants for political gain. Protestants battled Protestants out of fear. Empires allied with traditional enemies in hopes of weakening rivals. The war became a beast of contradictions, devouring whatever sense of order remained. No one understood fully who fought whom, or why, or for how long. Even diplomats found themselves lost in the shifting tides, drawing maps they knew would be outdated before the ink dried. Armies learned to survive off the land, which meant the land was left in ruins. Wheat fields turned to wastelands before harvest. Orchards were felled for firewood. Families buried their valuables and fled into forests, praying the soldiers would not track them. But soldiers always did. The war taught them that the easiest plunder lay not in cities but in the pockets of the desperate. The most horrific enemy was not a foreign army, it was hunger, disease, and the merciless passing of seasons that respected neither side. Winter after winter arrived with sharpened teeth. Snow swallowed the corpses of battlefields. Wolves fed on the fallen. Entire regions froze in silence, their people too weak to cry out, their rulers too consumed with battle to offer relief. Pestilence traveled with the soldiers, creeping into homes, killing without mercy or warning. What swords did not destroy, sickness completed. As years passed, the conflict grew less about victory and more about endurance. Leaders clung to strategies long after they proved hopeless, afraid to be the first to retreat. Pride kept the war alive as much as politics. Every nation involved believed that surrender would mean annihilation not just of land, but of identity. So they fought on, even as their populations dwindled, even as farms died, even as kingdoms flirted with collapse. The war became a crucible for new powers eager to rise. Young generals emerged with fresh strategies. States on the brink of obscurity saw opportunities to assert themselves. The great Habsburg Empire fought desperately to maintain its influence. Scandinavian kingdoms, once distant observers, plunged into the fray seeking glory and advantage. France, calculating and patient, maneuvered itself into a position where the chaos of others became the foundation of its future dominance. Every victory sowed the seeds of another war. Every defeat left scars too deep to heal. The conflict fed on itself, becoming a perpetual force that pulled Europe further from peace. With every passing year, no battlefield victory could resolve what pride, fear, and ambition continuously Even religion, the spark that had set everything aflame, lost its clarity. Faith, once the banner of armies, became an excuse behind which rulers masked conquest. Priests who once preached unity now sanctified bloodshed. Ministers blessed soldiers who marched to destroy believers of their own creed. The people, once willing to die for their faith, now died simply to survive. Religion became the language of war, not its purpose. And in this chaos, Europe learned a harsh truth. War does not merely reshape borders. It reshapes the soul of nations. It teaches cruelty. It breeds desperation. It erases innocence. The generation born into the conflict grew up knowing nothing but loss. They watched their homelands become arenas where foreign kings played out, Ambitions detached from human suffering. They learned to measure years, not by harvests, but by military campaigns. Not by festivals, but by. The conflict dragged on because no leader could afford to let it end. Too much pride was at stake. Too many promises had been made. Too many enemies had risen. Too many alliances depended on bloodshed to survive. What had begun as a defensive belief had become a continent-wide struggle for supremacy. Struggle that demanded more lives, more land, more sacrifice than any ruler had imagined. Europe's identity cracked further with each campaign. Kingdoms that once stood firm wavered. Principalities vanished from maps. Entire regions became lawless, ruled by whoever had the strongest swords that week. Diplomats attempted negotiations countless times, but every truce shattered under the weight of suspicion. Peace, once a hope, became an impossibility. The war consumed all, not because its leaders wanted devastation, but because they believed they could control it. They believed victory lay just beyond the next battle, the next alliance, the next winter. But the war had grown beyond them, feeding on the continent itself. It no longer needed kings to guide it. It moved under its own power, driven by momentum, fury, and fear. This was the crucible of Europe, a place where nations burned and ambitions collided, where survival became the only victory, and where the war that began with a spark transformed into a force that threatened to swallow an entire world. The alliances that once seemed firm now shifted like loose gravel beneath marching boots, and uncertainty hung over every border. Yet even as the foundations of kingdoms trembled, the conflict took on a new and more sinister shape, one in which the war was no longer simply a contest of political wills or religious dogma, but a relentless engine devouring entire societies. As the struggle widened, the ambitions of rulers fused with desperation, and desperation with fury. The battlefield sprawled into the daily life of common people, turning fields, villages, and cities into unwilling participants in a conflict they neither desired nor understood. What emerged was a storm without a single center, a war that no longer obeyed the logic of kings, councils, or generals, but fed on chaos itself. Armies wandered like hungry beasts, surviving off the land not by right but by force. A new language arose, not of diplomacy, but of suffering. The fields that once promised harvests now became desolate plains, scarred by thousands of bootprints. Smoke drifted across horizons where church steeples and farmhouses once stood. Famine became a shadow that traveled with armies, arriving before them or lingering long after they had passed, as if the land itself recoiled from their presence. People learned to live with silence, with loss, with the echo of distant thunder that they prayed was only weather but rarely was. And in this spreading darkness, ambition found fertile soil. New powers entered the conflict not out of loyalty to cause, but out of opportunity. What had begun as a dispute between faiths now widened into a struggle for supremacy, one in which nations saw the chaos not as tragedy but as invitation. For some rulers, the war became a ladder. For others, a trap. Yet all were swept forward by the same relentless tide. With the map of Europe fracturing, smaller states became bargaining chips in negotiations they were never invited to attend. Borders blurred, allegiances reversed, and armies marched in circles of violence. Treaties were signed with quills still wet from deceit, and broken before the ink had dried. The war was no longer measured in battles won, but in lives unmade. And still, leaders insisted that the struggle must continue, convinced that the next campaign would finally bring clarity, or victory, or peace, though none came. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Winter arrived, a foe as deadly as any army. Soldiers who had fought fiercely just days before now froze to death in the same fields. The biting cold claimed them before the enemy ever could. Horses collapsed by the hundreds, their carcasses left beside carts stuck in mud that refused to dry. Swollen rivers, once mere obstacles, became impassable barriers, splitting armies and leaving them stranded. It was as if nature itself had grown weary of the constant conflict, unleashing storms that tore supply lines to shreds and unleashing diseases that swept through camps like wildfire. Hunger drove desperate men to desperate acts. The war no longer cared if you were a soldier or a civilian. It was a blanket of misery that covered everyone equally. Yet, ambition refused to die. Leaders still commanded armies, believing that sheer numbers could overcome the chaos. On maps, strategists drew neat lines, ignoring the grim reality that the land they were carving up was already dying. Cities hid behind fortified walls, but no stone barrier could stop the invisible enemies of plague and starvation. A structure that took months to build could be reduced to ashes in a single night of fire, and like the war itself, that fire only needed a spark to ignite. The conflict then shifted, not because of a decisive battle, but through a slow, grinding erosion. Nations bled resources, not in grand clashes, but in an endless war of attrition. Gold poured into military coffers until there was none left. Farms stood empty, their laborers gone to war. The courts overflowed with people pleading for relief from the suffering. Diplomats traveled with increasing urgency, their words heavy with exhaustion. They knew that every month the war dragged on. Entire regions teetered, closer to total collapse. And still, the drums of war beat on. The conflict's reach extended even into the spiritual realm. Churches, once places of sanctuary, were now makeshift barracks or charred, skeletal ruins. Priests struggled to explain a world that seemed to have been abandoned by any divine order. Faith, which had once been a pillar for many, became just another casualty. For countless people, belief was no longer found in sermons, but in the simple, desperate act of survival one day at a time, one night at a time, one uncertain dawn after another. And still, the armies marched. Some pushed forward, convinced that victory was just over the horizon. Others marched because they were more terrified of what lay behind them than what was ahead. Few could even remember why the war had started, but everyone felt that ending it was impossible. The tangled web of alliances, the bruised pride of monarchs, the crushing weight of vengeance, it all created a knot so complex that no sword seemed sharp enough to cut through it. Each campaign added new threads of grievance. Each victory created new enemies. Each defeat only deepened the resentment. The war no longer needed a reason to exist. It sustained itself on the momentum of its own pain. As the conflict entered its later years, the suffering reached a scale not seen in generations. Entire provinces lost more people to famine than to the sword. Disease claimed children faster than anyone could bury them. Families simply vanished from one season to the next. Travelers told grim stories of roads lined with abandoned wagons, of fields left unplowed for years, of forests slowly reclaiming once thriving towns. They spoke of villages where not a single living soul remained, their wells dry, their doors swinging eerily in the wind. Nature had grown indifferent to the fate of humanity, and humanity, in turn, had grown numb to the staggering scale of its own tragedy. But somewhere within this bleak expanse, the first signs of exhaustion began to appear among those in command. The numbers in the account books told a stark, undeniable truth. There was simply nothing left to spend. Recruitment lists grew shorter as populations dwindled. Royal coffers, once overflowing, now rang hollow. Advisors who had once called for glory now spoke in hushed tones, urging caution, urging compromise, urging peace. Not out of a newfound morality, but out of sheer, desperate necessity. Even the proudest kings could not ignore the devastation forever. Negotiations began. They were cautious, quiet, like hesitant steps onto thin ice. Representatives from warring nations gathered behind closed doors. They carried with them not only the demands of their rulers, but also the silent, desperate prayers of millions who longed for an end to the bloodshed. Diplomacy, once drowned out by the noise of war, now became the last refuge for a continent on the verge of breaking. But mistrust lingered like smoke from a dying fire. Every proposal was met with resistance. Every concession sparked new fears. The war had taught an entire continent to doubt everything except the certainty of suffering. And so, the path to peace was slow, uneven, and incredibly fragile. As the discussions inched forward, the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Armies remained poised at the borders that had been redrawn so many times they had lost all meaning. Soldiers continued to sharpen their blades, even as diplomats sharpened their words. For every region where a flicker of optimism appeared, another still smoldered with unresolved anger. Peace felt close enough to imagine, yet still distant enough to fear. If the talks failed, everyone knew the war could reignite with an even greater, more destructive ferocity. But persistence finally succeeded where brute force had failed. One by one, the threads of negotiation were tightened, woven into a framework strong enough to hold the hopes of nations. Terms were debated, changed, and finally accepted. Old grievances were set aside, not forgiven, but buried beneath the urgent need for survival. Slowly, painstakingly, a vision for a different future began to take shape, one where borders might finally stabilize and fields might finally heal. The war that had begun with a single spark of defiance now approached its end, not with a triumphant victory, but with a collective, bone-deep exhaustion. It was a shared recognition that more violence offered nothing but deeper ruin for everyone. And so, after decades of turmoil, the final agreements emerged. They carried the remnants of fear, the hard-learned lessons of loss, and the fragile promise of stability. As ink was put to parchment, the echoes of battle still lingered in the air, but the drums at last fell silent. The fires of sieges cooled. A continent that had endured unimaginable suffering now stood on the threshold of something new, a tentative peace, shaped not by victory, but by the shared understanding that no one could survive another catastrophe of this magnitude. Yet, beneath that quiet, the scars remained. They were etched into the land, into memory, and into the very fabric of society. The cost of the conflict would echo for generations, shaping borders, faiths, identities, and ambitions for centuries to come. The war was over, but its shadow would long outlive its final battle. A stark reminder to all who survived that peace, once lost, is never easily regained. The war's final embers faded, but the silence that followed was not one of triumph. It was a silence of reckoning. A continent that had marched so confidently into conflict now stood humbled, changed in ways no treaty could ever fully capture. The scars across its fields, its cities, and its people were not just reminders of what had been lost. They were warnings of how fragile order can be when pride overrules reason, and belief is twisted into a weapon. What emerged from those long years was not the world that had existed before. It was something new, reshaped by fire, tempered by suffering, and bound together by the hard-earned understanding that devastation on such a scale must never be allowed to happen again. Out of the ruin came reflection. Out of reflection came resolve. And from that, resolve grew a cautious, rather hope that future generations might learn their lessons not from the banners carried into battle, but from the graves left behind. The 30 Years' War did not simply end. It left a continent staring into the mirror of its own making, forced to admit the devastating cost of forgetting its own humanity in the relentless pursuit of power. And though peace finally settled over its weary lands, the echoes of that cataclysm would live on, shaping history long after the last soldier had laid down his arms. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this journey through history meaningful, please consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. See you next time.